Welcome, everybody, to the Culture of Life podcast. My name is Andrew Jacoby, and I am blessed to be joined here in Washington, D.C. by Professor DC Shindler, the Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology at the JP2 Institute, John Paul II Institute here at Catholic University. Beautiful place as well, Professor. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for making the long drive down here. But,
it's a Catholic show, so I believe the incarnational aspect of it is important. I don't like the Zoom calls.
That is a great approach.
Labor of
take.
love.
Absolutely,
it's a labor of love. So, okay, there's so much I want to talk to you about. But I you're most famous, at least in my mind, for your musings about politics and answering the burning question in my political, philosophical mind, which is, did the United States start off with the proper principles and then went away from them such that we're in a place of insanity, division, and craziness?
Right.
Or was it baked in from the beginning?
Yeah.
Where do you land on that?
Well, I mean,
I know.
So I'm going to be paradoxical and just say yes.
I love that answer. That's a great
I mean, I think in a way they're both true because so this is a very serious question. It gets asked a lot, and the reason it's an important question is it affects very much how the relationship that we have now. It's not just a historical question. It's sort of a question of the nature of the problem, the nature of our relationship to our country, the country that we were born in and love and ought to love as Catholics even, and how to make sense of where to go in the future. So it's a very big question. But my answer would be, the reason I say it's both is when people ask that question, sometimes they think that that this position that I normally take, and I'm following many people, including my father, on this, that the failure was baked in, that some people think that means what's being claimed there is that somehow the founding fathers had this explicit philosophical vision that they were trying to sort of sneak past people or trying to institute this this problematic vision, and it's clearly much more complicated than that. I think that for the most part, and I know there's some very significant exceptions here, but for the most part, they wanted a Christian vision. They wanted to create a nation that preserved the Christian faith. Again, for the most part, that they envisioned a country of respect for life, to touch on the basic theme here, and to promote the proper worship of God and all those sorts of things. Okay, the problem to my mind wasn't their explicit intentions. The problem is, and this gets us into a big issue right from the start here, but it seems to me that the question of tradition is really crucial. I believe that the Christian tradition that was safeguarded by the Catholic Church is, you might say, the soul of Western civilization. And the soul, I mean that in the Aristotelian sense, the organizing principle. It's what holds all the parts together and gives them life. And so when the culture broke from the Catholic Church specifically, the living principle, the living unity with that organizing principle was lost. And so all of the principles may still have been there, or the parts may still have been there. A certain conception of man, a certain conception of the importance of the Bible, and even the classical tradition, all these kinds of things, but they no longer had this unifying principle. So in that sense, I think the dissolution was already begun with the you might say with the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. The dissolution was begun, but it was so subtle initially because it was sort of implicitly brought into an otherwise heroic even effort to hold on to self-evident truths about human nature and so forth. So that it took a long time for things really to unravel.
Got it. So there's like, I heard Bishop Barron asked you that question as well. If you were in the room with the founders, what would you want to know? And you were asked this question you're like, well, I'd like to know what they mean by nature's God.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, what are you talking about?
That's right.
Like, are we talking about a deist sort of Jeffersonian idea of God, where you cut out all the parts in Jesus in the Bible, or do you mean like the God of the Bible?
Yeah.
So this Patrick Deneen talks a lot about this, the idea that maybe we were the seed corn of Christianity is what founded the country, was strong in the beginning, maybe even strong enough to hold it, but then we ate that seed corn and it's gone now, essentially. Yeah. And now we're back to the sort of wherever we are. I don't know where we are.
It's kind of interesting. There's a German political philosopher whose last name is Birkenförde. How's that for a German name? Who articulated this principle that I think is really insightful. In his assessment of liberalism, he said that liberalism basically depends for its consistency on a substance that it can't produce itself.
Right.
And so liberalism will work in a culture that's already basically Christian, that sort of thing. And I think he's basically right about that. I would add one thing though. It's not simply that it depends on a substance that it can't provide, but that it also has within itself a certain logic that erodes that substance.
The individual, the sort of focus on the individual, is that the main, if you had to boil it down, is that the main
That
problem?
Is one of the main problems. Yeah, I think it's more, I would want to present that as one of the symptoms of an even deeper problem, which has to do with the way I put it in the Politics of the Real is a severing of potency from act in the highest principle. So in other words, we so take nature's God as an example. That is meant to be a kind of a placeholder for the God of any given tradition. It's not an actual recognition of
God of the Bible,
a reception of a tradition that's given. Right. You sort of step outside of the tradition. You're looking, okay, let's have a placeholder here that can accommodate many options. And what happens, I mean, on the surface, that seems like it's no problem, because as long as it accommodates our option, we're going to be happy with it.
And maybe we stop killing each other like we were before. I mean, that's the main argument, right? Like, hey, we're all killing each other for this,
that's
right, all in Europe. So let's try not to do that.
That's right. And that's pretty compelling.
Right.
On the face of it. But that's why it's really a kind of a subtle thing. What you end up doing is making the highest principle, rather than that being something that's given and received as already putting a claim on me. A tradition is something I receive and that I conform to, so it precedes me and it puts a claim on me. Therefore, we bracket that and make the very first principle an option, so that in fact it's something that I choose rather than something that chooses me, you might say.
Right.
And once we have that framework of this kind of potent possibility rather than actuality, that becomes a really difficult principle to organize a common human existence. And one of the things that it encourages is this kind of radical individualism that you're talking about. But the reason I hesitate to begin with that is that I also think that it encourages something that we're seeing more and more now, which is a loss of the individual, a kind of dissolution of the self. I mean, there's a certain sense
in favor of what?
Yeah. Oh, in favor of market forces, in
we're
favor
just a cog
of social
in production. Yeah. We're just we're a cog in a machine to produce goods.
Yeah, that's right. Or we are an avatar, in social media that that can be presented in any possible way.
You don't think that's an accident of technology? You think that that's actually built in, or the technology is also a flourishing or a flowering of that same idea underneath?
Yeah,
it just happens to coincide.
It's an expression of so. I used to think that, you know, as you were pointing, that the main problem is this: we're just these atoms, you know, atomistic individuals isolated from one another. But the problem is that it seemed to me increasingly clear that there's a kind of a tendency towards a collectivism, you know, an absorption into greater wholes. Tocqueville, for instance, talked about the tyranny of the majority.
Sure.
And that's something, you know, he was thinking of it in, you know, it had a very simple meaning in a way for him. The only social media. Oh, it's interesting, first of all, that he tied it to the influence of newspapers. So he was already, in a way, pointing to
media-centric in that.
Yeah.
In that critique.
And he saw that this was a kind of an instrument of this tendency to eclipse the substantial agency of individuals by a kind of you know, a supra-individual force of forces and currents and influences and pressures and so forth. And, you know, he pointed to the newspapers and he said, just think, you know, hundreds of people are you know, witnessing something at the very same time.
Yeah,
hundreds.
That sounds
of
interesting.
people.
It's kind of like what Girard was talking about. We have such this tendency towards the mimetic.
That's right.
That if you give us media, one writer who's particularly powerful can get us all, you know,
that's
kind
right.
of whipped up into a fury.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the thing that it's so interesting to think. You know, I think especially from the conservative side, typically people want to criticize the culture as being too selfish. But I think it's more complicated than that. That in a certain sense that's right, but there's also this kind of loss of any sense of identity.
Interesting.
And this desperate clinging to things that are unnatural as a means of discovering identity. I mean, the kind of social media addictions are most you know, most obvious example of that, but also a certain disordered attachment to like a political party. Right. Or a movement, or even, you know,
various ways
of
immanentizing the eschaton, right? Or saying like we're going to find the solution. The lions will lay down with the lambs if Trump is or isn't elected. Or
yeah, that's right. That's right. And so much so that then the world immediately becomes, you know, everything that is in favor of this is good, and everything that is not in favor is evil.
Because we don't have the lamb to come down as the solution, as the to take on all of our faults. It's the other. It's again a Girard point, which is the Girardian point.
Yeah, yep.
Very interesting. I was listening to Patrick Deneen's critique of liberalism, and he talks about how there's this sort of, on the right, you have this sort of market fundamentalism. So if we can buy and sell it, then it's fine. And this leads to pornography and prostitution and all kinds of horrors that you see there in the exploitation of the individual. Yeah. The left, I'm a little, how does it, on that side, it seems to be a bifurcating kind of problem. On the one hand, you have this social experimentation, sort of, hey, the family, what are you talking about? Like, there's no need for the conjugal view of the family, like the Robert George arguments about, if two people love each other, they're a family. 5 people love each other, a man and a dog, whatever. Right. So you have that. But then also, Deneen talks about how the left has this tendency to, in order to perceive their individual flourishing, they need the state to grow in a huge way. Yeah. In order to, because it's unequal. We're all unequal in talent and everything. So we need a really large hand to come in and level the playing field. Do you see? Am I thinking through that right in terms of like how this liberalism kind of plays out on both sides of the political aisle that we would see today, and we might think are fighting, but are actually on the same side in a certain way? Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, they're opposed on the surface, but there's a similar model that bifurcates in precisely this sort of way, which, you know, to me, it's kind of interesting
why we speak of a polarization, because there's something really artificial about this kind of bifurcation. It will tend to 50-50 divides, I find that kind of fascinating, because that's a sort of an unnatural thing. But in any event, that's a bit abstract. I think that the relationship, this is something that many people have seen. Robert Nisbet, a sociologist from last century, was very insightful about this, and he made the argument that whenever you have a kind of radical individualism, it's always going to coincide with a kind of collectivism. The over emphasis on the individual is going to lead to a kind of centralization of power and a control sort of from above. This is something. There's a very interesting French political philosopher, Bertrand de Juvenel, who made this argument. He wrote A History of Power, and he made the same claim. Grassroots movements are always controlled by some sort of centralized power, and that sounds like a hermeneutics of suspicion, but there's a logic to it, and you see, historically speaking, this has worked itself out. So one of the reasons is that if the world is just made up of atoms that are all equal and unconnected, there's nothing that can give that form, you might say, internally, that in an organic sort of fashion, in the way that a family has a kind of a natural order to it and so forth. A family is by its very nature not a democracy. It's not a collection of unrelated individuals. There's a very complex asymmetrical relationship between the mother and the father, the children and the parents, and I mean, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if there's no might say principles from below, there's no kind of organic principle of order. The only way to have order is to impose it from above in a kind of coercive fashion. And that increasingly will take the shape of a single, because if it's not a single power, a centralized power, it's going to remain sort of chaotic.
Didn't Plato talk about this in terms that's where ultimately democracies go to? They turn into a sort of strongman tyranny over.
That's right.
Because both sides eventually start to accuse the other of like all kinds of nefariousness, and then some guy comes along and says, "Okay, I'll run the show." Kick the jokers out. And,
right.
And
I mean, it's so interesting because it can only be this kind of extrinsic influence.
Right.
When you have no ontological principle of order. I mean, that's, Plato has so many of these kinds of things. He seems like he's exaggerating, but he turns out to be right pretty much all of the time. It's
so we need a philosopher king, according to him.
Yeah,
that's so interesting. Okay, and I know that so we've diagnosed the problem more or less. Let's say that there's different solutions. You have, kind of your Adrian Vermeule, Sohrab Ahmari, this group of what you would call the integralists. I went to a conference on Franciscan where they were talking a lot about this a couple of years ago, and they're saying, okay, well, we can use the administrative state and we can sort of impose a Catholic vision. There's going to be a vision.
Yeah.
The lie of liberalism was we're going to have this empty, the empty public square of philosophy of the strong gods, as Rusty Reno would say. We're going to empty it of that and just do what you want. That's a lie. We all accept it. So let's put the church in. Yeah. It makes sense.
Yeah.
That's the one view. I might be caricaturing their view, and you can correct me where I'm wrong. But that's like sort of some kind of confessional state, let's say. Then there's the other guys I listen to is the New Polity guys, which I love, Andrew Willard Jones and these guys. They're like, no, really, if you listen to Aristotle, the politics is about friendships and relationships. So that can only be done at the local level. Yeah. So if there's going to be a change, we have to just build communities like Steubenville. Yeah. And we just keep building them the same way they did, maybe a Rod Dreher or the Benedict option. Maybe we just build a bunch of these and people are attracted to them because they're sane and they want to live there.
Right.
And then over a long period of time, get out of your head, it's going to change quickly.
Yeah.
Long period of time, that's what will happen. We'll re-Christianize the pagans again like we did before. Where are you in this
Yeah.
solution side?
It's funny. I mean, from the
Diagnosis
beginning,
is fun, but
yeah,
more fun.
yeah.
You
Well,
don't have to propose anything.
the problem with the solution side is whenever you're talking politics, solutions are so particular to given circumstances and situations that the solution is prudential. So it's hard to articulate a universal principle. This is the program.
This is the answer.
I mean, because programs aren't what we need, really.
Right.
That's okay. But given the characterization, it is kind of funny. I mean, because from the beginning, I've always been critical of the integralists, but I often get grouped with them.
Because you're Catholic.
Yeah, I guess that must be why. It's funny. Somebody once described me as integralism light, and he meant it as a compliment. But I said, that's like the worst of all worlds. But I mean, the thing is, I'm very sympathetic with the integralists. This idea that the church needs to be recognized as having authority, and an authority that embraces the political sphere. And I think that that's true. But the problem is, and this gets into some niceties. It gets a bit sophisticated and subtle. But the problem is that authority is very different from power. Simply, even though they're closely related, there's a distinction between authority and power. And the idea that you could simply take the sort of machinery of the modern state and direct it to a different end, or make a certain end explicit, that's a mechanistic view of how politics works, and that reduces authority to power. I mean, that's one way to describe the distinction, is that power is a kind of mechanized, technologized version of authority. Authority, properly speaking, always operates more concretely. So in this regard, I'm very much on the side of the New Polity guys. I've been involved in their
They're
magazine.
great. I love their podcast.
Their
It's
magazine,
really.
And they're also with the college that they started. I
didn't know they started
on
a
the
college.
board. Yeah, the College of St. Joseph the Worker. This is something
Oh wow.
you and your listeners should really look into.
I'd love to.
It's just opened this past year, and it's an extraordinary thing. I think this model is going to become sort of a model for the future. Anyway, authority works in a more organic way, and one of the expressions of an organic sense of order is this primacy of the local and the, so all of that I agree with. One dimension, though, that I would press, I think some of my friends at New Polity is that I do think that there is one has to also think of the, and they wouldn't disagree with this. I don't think, but one has to think also. It's not purely from below is not sufficient. There also is a kind of from above dimension. That doesn't mean co-opting the state as such, but it does mean that we do have to think in terms of the overarching principles of organization and governance when we think through how to revitalize a Catholic.
Right, you can't just have a bunch of families get together and make a cookie co-op. Or
Yeah,
whatever.
that's
You
right.
gotta
That's
have.
right.
You have to have. There's going to be some power.
Yeah,
And the authority would be the church having, well, let's say members of the church kind of being a check on the powerful in a way. Like they're not making the rules, but they are, let's say, on questions of what is the human person.
Yeah.
On questions
Right.
of like, hey, we're crossing moral lines
Right.
here
yeah.
that we can't be crossing. Is that where the church
the way I
have
would
a-
put it, so I would say there's something even deeper than the check, because when you're talking about a check, you're talking about sort of powers acting on each other. I think even though that's part of the picture, I would want to insist on something more positive, which is we need to recognize the Christian tradition as authoritatively interpreting the meaning of things. What is a human person? What is marriage?
Right.
What is life?
Your job,
What
metaphysics,
is- yeah.
anthropology.
And then you say, okay, this is what these things are in truth. Now you in your political order,
Yeah.
you
Go
figure out the
out-
best
right.
way to preserve this.
Right. Go make the rules about the highway, but don't
exactly.
kill people in the
Yeah,
process.
that's right.
Right.
Well,
don't,
and make
turn
rules,
them into
right.
end. Don't turn them into means.
That's right. Make rules about the highway, but even make rules about marriage. But make rules about marriage. Here's what marriage is.
Right.
You figured out how the best way to regulate this in the particularities of this circumstance.
And marriage is such a difficult one because under the logic of liberalism, it's so hard to make a case for traditional marriage.
That's right.
It's impossible. It's like, who are you to tell
right.
me like who can get married, who
me,
I can love?
I used to say
it's
this.
Like, it's impossible.
I used to say this. Yeah.
Can't make the case.
20 years ago, I got into some arguments that I thought that in a way, the more decisive issue is going to be marriage, even
versus abortion.
More than abortion. And the reason was, in a certain sense, there's more at stake in abortion because we're talking about
the death of
a death of a human being, right? A death of a person. That this is, that there's that's massive. But in a curious way, I think it's easier to make arguments, pro-life arguments using the terms of liberalism,
right? Because the child has rights,
exactly.
So that's like
is an individual like you and I are
exactly,
individuals and that kind of thing.
Or the great what was it, Christopher K's or the future like you argument, which I love. It's like why can't I kill you? Well, I would take away what from you? Let's say I could do it non-painless, like I could do it painlessly.
Yeah.
What would I be stealing from you? My future. Okay. Well, the baby's got more future than you.
Yeah, that's right. That's
but
right.
It's not aware of it. Okay, whatever. Yeah. But anyway, it's much easier. But the
marriage does.
Marriage is
so
hard.
that's
marriage
why
really hard.
it seems to me. I mean, that's
really hard.
part of the point of the John Paul II Institute here, where I teach, is to think through these questions. And there's always been a recognition around these halls here of the way that the question of marriage actually touches on the question of meaning, the theology of the body, and then even like the meaning of matter, the meaning of institutions. That it opens up to the whole shebang.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a big topic these days, this idea of Rod Dreher's new book, Living in Wonder, Ian McGilchrist. There's a lot of people talking about this idea of or Ed Feser even, the return of the formal and final cause, which we've abandoned essentially in the Aristotelian, right? We don't like those. We like efficient and material. We're okay with those causes, but formal and final, we especially as it relates to sex organs.
That's right. Well, I mean, the irony is that we don't even know what efficient and material causes are precisely because we've eliminated the others.
Yeah,
I mean, we transform all of them. That's part of the.
You can get people to talk about it with their eyes, but once you go below the belt, all of a sudden,
that's right.
That simple reasoning of like, well, how do you know what it's for?
Yeah.
It doesn't just goes out the window.
But isn't that? I mean, it's
not for anything.
Yeah.
There's no purpose. But your eyes do.
The thing is, there you go. But what's so curious is that people, will say something like, "Well, I see that this is true, but I'm not going to impose it on somebody else."
Right. That's the thing.
And that we could think about that issue for a long time. There's quite a bit packed into that.
100%.
But one of the things is you're also sort of protecting your own freedom falsely understood.
Right, of course.
By trying to acknowledge, the rights of the other
freedom.
person.
Right. Yeah. I think Rusty Reno's good with this. After World War II, we had a very strong aversion to telling anybody else what to do because the strong gods were what caused us to almost destroy the entire planet.
Yeah.
So let's just eliminate anything that smacks of an opinion that's real that would be binding on someone else.
That's right.
And and his concept is that we're going to see the return because obviously that's what all these right-wing movements are.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, so do you see the connection? Do you see a connection between that point that you just made and this question of the American founding that we started with?
I think my first answer is no, but let me think about it for a second. I think yes. Okay, now I see where you're going. I think where you're going is that a founding was an attempt from people who came over from the European continent to not have a repetition of what they were seeing in their continent, which was the wars of the 30 Years' War. All the wars of religion, essentially, the Protestant and also the Muslim. So they were trying to avoid that. They were trying to come up with what can we all agree on that everybody could agree on. They went to a deist kind of model. And so that would be the connection that I
Yeah.
would see. And
So, I
attempt
mean,
to
right.
eliminate the strong gods.
The strong gods, yeah, that's right. By making it generic in a
Right,
way.
right.
So you see that, I mean, what we see now really was established in the beginning, even though the context was so different, the intentions were very different in a certain way. The logic was already there,
Right.
so that the people that want to, even promote, Satanism as one of the religions or whatever,
Right.
we should or non-religion as an expression of freedom of religion. They have an easy time actually
Right.
pointing to the founders
Right.
to justify it.
Why
Now,
wouldn't I?
the objection is always, well, that's not what the founders intended.
Who cares? They were white men.
Right. That's
Yeah, who
right. That's right. You just say, well, that's their,
That was
but
then,
the
and this
principles
is
they
now.
establish allow this, and
Right.
it's hard to disagree.
And it's hard to disagree that Satanism isn't the main. I mean, it's the deification of the self. So it's
Yeah.
kind of the de facto religion of the country. Actually, I mean, I don't mean that, people wouldn't know that. It wouldn't be self.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say that, but
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Yeah.
Because either God is God or you're God.
That's
So,
right.
I mean, Satanism is the worship of self.
Yeah.
So we're getting into these deeper questions of material, the meaning of nature itself, right?
Yeah.
And I want to go here because I had an interview with a Franciscan nun, who's a theology professor at Villanova, and she's a big fan of. She's got a center dedicated to the study of Chardin, Teilhard de Chardin.
Okay.
This idea of progressive theology.
Right.
So her thesis is that if Thomas Aquinas were sitting here with you and I today and looking at the world and the new, we're learning about quantum physics, for
Right.
example, he wouldn't be looking to Aristotelian simple causality.
Yeah.
He would laugh at such a thing because,
Yeah.
okay, yes, on one level that's true, but there's all this entanglement. There's
Right.
there's so much strangeness
Right.
in the universe today.
Yeah.
And the entire church we're losing
Right.
the world because we're stuck with this medieval concept,
Yeah.
which is defunct. Everybody knows it's
Yeah.
defunct.
Yeah.
Look at what we know now. Like
Yeah.
I don't know anything about quantum physics, so but I've heard somebody said on a podcast, they're like, every millionth of a second you change from
Yeah.
wave to particle
Yeah.
or particle to wave,
Yeah,
like you
yeah.
turn to light.
Yeah.
I just can't perceive it.
Yeah.
It's like, so her point was that God is an evolution, so there's no
Yeah.
simple God.
Yeah.
It's an underlying force of love that is ever evolving. This fecundity of life that is we're
Yeah.
moving towards God in a way. So forget the normativity. It's all based on a metaphysic that we can throw out
Yeah.
because it's not with the times.
Right.
Do you have
Yeah,
any thoughts on
yeah,
that? 'Cause
no.
it scrambled my brain.
Yeah. Well, those are always good questions and need to be faced. I mean, I would say it's interesting. You mentioned Phaser and some others that have been making this argument that Aristotle's coming back.
Right.
I mean, the fascinating thing is, the first thing I would say is that one has to be very careful to distinguish between metaphysics and physics, first of all, and then between physics and classical in the philosophical tradition and physics in the modern sense.
Got it.
So, and the reason that that's important is that in a way, the kinds of causality that Aristotle was talking about, precisely because it was not an positivistic empirical judgment, it can accommodate all sorts of. It can actually it gives you tools to think about all sorts of positive evidence. So even when the evidence changes, it's still. I mean, the very notion of change, for instance.
Right. The idea of something from nothing, a quantum. It's coming from nothing.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. And you're using principles of order. You're using principles. I mean, order actually is a really big one. You're talking about features of things. So that there are all sorts of concepts that, from classical natural philosophy, I'll call it to make the distinction between that and modern physics, they actually are in a way increasingly valuable
How so?
to make sense. So I'll give you one example that I find fascinating. There's a quantum physicist who has some strange ideas. I don't follow him on everything.
It's weird stuff.
It is very weird stuff.
It's
Yeah.
Like, it's like
but there are a couple principles, and quantum physics is incredibly complex. I mean, unless you know the math that gets involved is really at the highest level. But he's actually in the first place a mathematician. His name is Wolfgang Smith, and he has made an argument that Aristotelian concepts of act and potency and the Thomistic notion of the act of existence, esse, the to be of things, that actually gives us a way of that's been confirmed in a way by quantum mechanics over beyond the classical physics and the much more simplistic. I mean, if you're talking about simplistic causality, as this person, as according to your report, mentioned that it was too simplistic. Simplistic causality is really the classical physics, this early modern period. You wouldn't really call Aristotle. I mean, some of the empirical dimensions are simplistic, but the notion of causality is not simplistic at all. Right. And Wolfgang Smith has said that it actually can give us an insight into the uncertainty principle, the sort of wave particle duality, and not to get into too much abstraction here, but he makes a distinction between what he calls the physical and the corporeal, and associates the physical with, this is the quantum mechanical dimension, with something like Aristotelian potency. And one of the reasons that it behaves so strangely is that it's not actual.
Right. It has the potential and has this weird way of becoming actual.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
It's still there's still a potency in an act.
That's right. And we approach, the problem is that we approach these particles from a classical physics perspective, early modern physics. So we can't help but reify these things and think about subatomic particles as real beings, right. Actual things. And then they do this stuff that doesn't make any sense. But if you think of them rather in the order of potency than in the order of act, it actually makes a lot more sense.
Right. There are things in these to the extent that they have the potential to be in existence, and then sometimes they are in ways that we don't understand.
That's
quite.
right. That's right.
And
ways that don't follow,
our
simple
normal,
locality
simple.
And time and place and so forth. And that's something that is not actual wouldn't. Right. So I mean, it actually makes sense.
Right. It's very interesting. So there's that part is it's almost pre-physics in a way. It's just a more principle. Yeah. It's a philosophical principle that would underlie all things.
That's
essentially, because if they don't have the potential to be actual, then they wouldn't ever exist, but they do exist. Yeah. So they have a potential and an act.
Yeah.
So therefore, Aristotelian ways of thinking through that are still work.
And so I mean,
so there still has to be something that's pure act.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah, and that there's a kind of a sort of a causality of coming into being that's very different from the causality of collision, of the application of force or something like that. It's a very different kind of communication of energy, as it were.
Interesting.
So I mean, the point of all of this is just to say that in fact, far from our getting further and further away from ancient physics, we're actually there are all sorts of ways we're getting closer.
That's really interesting.
And obviously we can need to rethink these principles in light of our contemporary discoveries. But that's a much more interesting discussion if you recognize this point.
Interesting. So if Aquinas would be amazing to have a conversation with him anyway. But were he here and he could access all the information that, let's say, this woman and all the top physicists have, he would just say, that's interesting, and yet still potency and act are not harmed by any of this.
Not in the least, right? No, they become
and
even.
Still,
you get a deeper insight into and
still need pure act.
There's a kind of reciprocal illumination. Both we actually come to understand the metaphysical principles better, and they illuminate these kind of physical properties. And that's you. I mean, you do start to see that things like purpose are coming back in biological discussions, and even. I mean, beyond biology. I mean, we're starting to recognize what they used to call, spooky action at a distance.
Right. You can think about
Einstein,
something and it can happen.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
that things like that are starting to become evident in biology and zoology.
Your
and so
thought
forth.
about this would be that that's just evidence of the kind of Holy Spirit. I mean, that like if the Holy Spirit is real, then that is the quantum field that they're talking about in a way, right?
Well,
I mean, it's like it's this sort of ineffable love between the Father and Son that is infusing everything, which came down. Is that kind of how
I would want to say, first of all, it's evidence of metaphysical realities, but that these metaphysical realities, precisely as such, are open to the movement of the Holy Spirit. I wouldn't want to leap immediately.
So you want to combine them one to one.
Yeah. So the metaphysics is really a crucial part of it. What order is and what changes and those kinds of things.
So the forms they're sort of. Maybe the coming to fruition of something from the world of forms into the world of matter, let's say. I mean, there might be some permeation between those, but that's what it is. But that's not necessarily the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit might come to use some of that in some way for God's will.
Yeah, right. And if we actually have this deeper, we recognize that the realities that we see in the physical world are so much more mysterious and interesting than classical physics led us to believe. We realize that the Holy Spirit can reach into them.
Right. So this weirdness. So Bishop Barron had this conversation, and I asked Professor Theiner this, and I also asked this particular nun. So I'll ask you. So there's this controversy these days about the use of psychedelics then.
Yeah.
Okay, world is getting weird.
Yeah.
We now have these tools. Maybe we've discovered them in the Amazon. Now when I was a kid, it was like acid, like people taking LSD or mushrooms, peyote maybe.
That's right.
Now it's gotten even crazier. Like you're going down to weird plant things called ayahuasca, DMT, whatever. It's like, but through these experiences, people are having like revelations of God. Like they're coming to realize that the world is because we've flattened it, like your
That's
colleague who I'd love for you to put a good word in so you haven't get an interview with him. Anyway, Michael Hamby talks about this, how from post-Bacon, we flattened the world. It's just stuff.
That's right.
Right? And so we need this re-enchantment, and these people are okay. It's not the ideal way to go lick a frog in the Amazon, but okay, like if that's what you do and you can... You have your road to Damascus-ish experience.
That's right. Yeah.
What's wrong with that then?
Yeah.
But Bishop Barron was that's you can't get there that way. That's not licit.
Several things to say about that. First of all, I have known people that have had genuine religious conversions because of the use of drugs, sort of accidentally. A lot of people do I mean, I even recently read Rod Dreher had some sort of experience like that. And so that was not my path, and I don't have much experience with all that. But I have to say, here's a kind of an interesting story. One of the most memorable experiences of my youth, when I was in high school. I had some friends that were very interested in, they were the Deadheads,
Sure.
And I loved music, and they explained to me that
it's
even better. Yeah. And so I thought, okay, they're making an argument, and that's actually kind of interesting. So I went to the library as the budding little kind of intellectual. I checked out a whole bunch of books on LSD, and I started reading them. And my dad came home, and he saw me sitting there with this stack of books about LSD, and he of course got a little freaked out, and he asked me what I was doing, and I laid out this argument, and I just said, okay, I'm thinking this through. It seems to me, if we seek enlightenment, we want, as human beings, we want to know. Yeah, and so if this is a way to find enlightenment, then shouldn't we be open to this? And I just asked my dad. We had a good relationship. I said, help me think through this, and it was kind of interesting. He said that there's no. I mean, you sort of indicated it right there. There's no magic button that you press. Right. That real insight always, if it's genuine wisdom, it cannot but come through some kind of suffering, some kind of ascesis, some sort of one. You really do have to climb the mountain. You can't just be catapulted. The 7-story mountain, and if you get there some other way,
You cheated. So
You've
even if they
cheated and
report
you
that
don't
they
know if
got
it's
there, it doesn't matter. So you would just say, well, like I converted because of this experience. You would say, well, then it's like the conversion is. You wouldn't say false, but
no.
it's like
So I would no, but that's
way?
I would say so. This isn't to speaking against people, but it seems to me that in the cases that I know, the people had an experience, and that then prompted them to actually climb the mountain.
Right, got it. Okay, so then at that point, the real conversion happened.
Yeah.
They had like an insight.
Yeah.
And then the insight provoked a real conversion.
Right. So suddenly they
got
saw,
it.
wait a minute, there
Got
is
it.
a dimension to reality that I didn't
right.
ever give.
It's much weirder than I thought.
But now I have to do the work to get there.
Right.
And so that's one thing. It would be very different if a person said, anytime I need to pray, I just take this tab,
Right.
And then I would say, yeah, that seems to me that's something you're talking about, something else.
Out in Silicon Valley, call it microdosing. They take little bits just to kind of like just tweak reality just a little bit. Yeah, it's like that's a very dangerous. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to help I've been interviewing a bunch of professors, running into a bunch of atheist professors. And I always make a pitch to them, and you're a sort of Plato master, and I try to do the best that I can to at least get them to Platonism, because as Lewis said, if I can get them to be a good pagan, then I can convert them.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about, okay, so you and I are having this conversation here. I say to my atheist friend, and I say, we're using words in order to reference something that we think is true. So what is truth? What are we talking about?
That's right.
It's this immaterial realm, database, however you want to imagine it, in the air or somewhere that's not in our heads, but that relates to reality. Yeah. So it's immaterial. Yeah. There's a logos to it. It has some, I don't know, influence on reality, or else what are we wasting our time talking about?
That's
like,
right.
why are we having this conversation if we can't come to anything that's independent of our own thoughts? And what I consistently get is we can't know any of that. Yes, I believe in math. Yes, I believe in numbers. But because my theory, correct me if I'm wrong, is I think I can get at least everybody to to at least Neo-Platonism.
Yeah,
I can get everybody because they make claims to truth.
Yeah,
am I right? Like, how do I go about that argument?
No, I think even just numbers are fascinating. I mean, how could numbers be possible? Unless you recognize something that transcends and has a kind of absoluteness about it. Skepticism, it's a hard nut to crack, because you can give perfectly decisive arguments.
Like, I can't know that. How do you can't know that? Yeah,
that's right. So I mean, in that sense, it's there's not a whole lot you can do. Right, that's what Aristotle at one point says. That you if a person denies absolutely everything, even denies that they're denying, they're effectively a vegetable, and you can't argue with a vegetable, but of course you don't have to. But it seems to me one thing that I find really interesting, this I can't know that. How can I know that sort of dismiss? Who's to say which truth? How do we know that there's truth? These kinds of things. You mentioned Plato in the beginning. He's a fascinating instance of this. Well, Socrates,
right? Sure.
Plato's Socrates, because in a certain sense, he also said that he didn't know anything. Right, that's his famous. That's his famous thing. Right.
You're the wisest guy
because you know that anything. You don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, but what's so interesting for him is that he didn't take that. He's not a skeptic in this sense that you were just illustrating there. He didn't say, okay, so all this stuff is worthless. There's no point in seeking truth. It wasn't sort of an automatic dismissal of any possible claim. For him, it meant that he had to actually test every claim that was given.
So it was a skepticism towards truth.
Yeah, right. Well, so how do you know that you don't know anything? I mean that's the irony. You say, well, how can we know? You're dismissing the possibility, but on what basis?
You don't know?
Yeah. On what basis do you dismiss the possibility? You can only really
know that you don't know. Right.
Yeah.
You're claiming knowledge.
That's right.
Right. You're making a claim. I know that I can't know that.
That's right.
How do
And
you
if
know
and
that?
if you want
Are
to
you
be
skeptical of your skepticism?
that's right. And if you are skeptical, if you want to be really serious,
Right.
think about it. And you actually then have to you actually have to start to make arguments and wonder about whether in fact I can say this, and then whether and the moment you take a step in that direction, you can't
Your
help
skepticism
but
falls apart.
Yeah.
Because like you're really not a skeptic because you're firm in your skepticism.
That's
So
right.
therefore you're not a skeptic.
That's right. That's right.
So you're kind of you're stuck in this like that's not true. Well, there is no truth. Is that true? You're stuck in this.
How do you know it's not true? I mean that would
Right.
be a way to ask somebody.
Right.
It's just like, how do you know it's not true?
Right.
Have
And
you
then you're
tested
in a
it? Have you
conversation.
thought about it? Yeah.
Is that what the principle of sufficient reason is? Are you saying is that what? Because Fraser talks a lot about that. He's like this idea where look, we come up with our best answers for almost everything in our life. Like we're never sure about anything,
yeah.
but we get in cars and we ride on planes. We
right.
come to conclusions about almost everything. Why do we bracket off?
Yeah.
It's kind of like the discussion earlier about
Yeah.
the sex organs. All of a sudden, I
Yeah.
can talk to you about purposes in your eyes, but
Right.
once I start talking about sex organs,
Suddenly,
I have
yeah.
no idea what they're for. It's like total random appendage on my body. It's just I don't know. I
Yeah.
woke up and there it was,
Yeah.
and I don't know what it's for. What could
That's
it be
right.
for?
That's right.
Possibly, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same. Is that what the principle of sufficient reason is? Is like we're sort of forced to come up with some conclusion because
Yeah.
Ratzinger says, look, you're making moral decisions.
Yeah.
So the question of
That's
whether
right.
there's a moral law
That's right.
is important. Like you
That's
have
right.
to answer that question because you're answering it de facto with your actions.
Yeah. Well, the principle of sufficient reason that that's a more complex history. One expression of it might be this that
Okay.
you're talking about. But the examples that you're giving, I think, point to something really important. And this is the other dimension of dealing with skeptics that I find attractive, and that is that rather than making arguments simply, you begin first with just finding out, is there something you care about? Like what do you care about? And then either a person cares about absolutely nothing.
So give me your money.
Yeah, right.
Give me
Which
all
is
your
not possible.
Give me all your cash.
Or they actually do care, but there's somebody they care about. They care about themselves.
Right.
They care about how something will turn out. They care about succeeding in this or that. And then you ask, okay, if you care about that, what does that, the very act of caring about something is committing you to certain beliefs about it.
Right, that it matters.
That it matters, and that
Why does it
that
matter?
it's something other than a figment of my imagination. And I actually have to do justice to this. I have to, meet its
There's a
demands.
principle of justice involved, and you're caring about something.
That's right.
It would be better if you didn't steal my money.
Yeah.
Why? It's
That's
just
right.
paper.
That's
what
right.
do you care?
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that in its you're sort of recognized. I mean, because the point of all of this is that if you really do care about something, admit that you care about it. You're pointing to some reality that is outside of you, that transcends you, and in some senses is greater than you. That because you're serving it somehow, you're protecting it. And that is the heart of this movement into the real. You might say.
Right. That's interesting. So the atheist. So is that your on the atheist question? In your opinion, in your experience talking to atheists, are most of them just trying to avoid the consequences of there being a moral law? Is that like that's when I boil almost everything down? When I have a lot of very intelligent people, I have the conversations all the time with people, and back of my head, I'm just like, you just don't want there to be anything wrong with anything you do.
Yeah,
like that's
right.
really what you don't want to be committed to.
Yeah,
you want to be committed to being sovereign over what you do, and there not being real. There couldn't be, in principle, real consequences to anything that you
couldn't take back in the next moment.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
which is odd because there's nobody that would say that.
Is that your really? That's when I boil it down. I'm like, we're not really talking about any of this.
But it's always about like particular areas, like you mentioned, like sort of sexual morality.
Yeah.
There's certain areas. I mean, there's nobody in the world that would that has no absolute moral principles.
Right.
So, I mean, my wife is really good on this. She was pointing out that there was some priest in a fairly high position. I can't remember the particular circumstances, that talked about the need for us to have a certain epistemic humility. We recognize that not everyone believes the same things that we do, and that it's not easy to, that there's a certain, we can't be absolute, it's the strong God sort of
Sure.
thing. We can't be absolutely certain about these things, so we need to have a certain, respect and leeway. And she pointed out to me, she said, well, do you think he would use that same principle in talking about racism?
Right. Yeah, and of course not. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
absolutely not.
Right.
So in that case,
Right.
suddenly we have
People are
like
sure about
absolute
racism, right? People are
epistemic
sure.
clarity
Right.
that
100%.
right, persecuting somebody because of
Right.
the color of skin is not right.
Right.
So there's no ambiguity
no-
there.
right.
So
There's
it always
no
happens to be in certain areas, but everybody will draw a line at a certain point. And that phenomenon itself is worth just highlighting. Say, we're not arguing whether there is morality. We're just arguing about
Is it
where
in
the
this
line
particular
is drawn.
area? Can
Yeah.
you do whatever you want in this particular area?
Yeah.
The last question I would have, there's actually two, but the one that's important to me, I've been listening to, okay, go back to the beginning of our discussion about the solution. We did diagnosis, we did some solutions, we critiqued our friends a little bit in Franciscan. I want to go out there and interview those guys. But there's this interesting debate online. This gentleman, John Vervaeke, he has this concept. Professor Vervaeke, I think he's at University of Toronto, friends with Jordan Peterson, and he has this idea. He was
I've had some conversations.
Have you
with
really?
him. Yeah,
amazing,
yeah.
right? Oh, that's right. I think
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
seen your conversations with him.
Yeah, no.
So he's
a
got this
remarkable
idea
person.
of this philosophical Silk Road, or the religious Silk
Mhm.
Road, where it's like, okay, look, guys, almost similar to what the Franciscan nun was talking about. Look, this Christianity stuff, I get it. It was hot in, the Middle Ages. It was great. You guys, it was high culture, amazing. But like, we're way beyond that. Look at around you. I mean, everyone's going to yoga.
Yeah.
There's all of these, this new age. We got the new quantum guys, and we got the Burning Man, and we've got to come up with a new kind of conglomeration where we're not committed to accepting Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior in America to be Americans.
Mhm.
It can't be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Is that project? Is his project doomed? Because I have this debate with my best friend Sean all the time, because he's a sort of lapsed Catholic and in the psychologist and into the similar Buddhism and all this. And so he's like, look, I'm not going back to the Catholic thing. So what are you going to do with me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not going back. So I can't be a citizen. Like, we got to come up with something else.
Yeah.
Buddhism's fine. Let's start with maybe we can mix something together. Jesus is a good guy. Buddha's a good guy.
Yeah. I mean, the problem. I mean, there's a lot to say to that. The first problem is if that means then sticking with this sort of generic placeholder for religion. I mean, we see the implications. The implications are actually
You can't
far.
do it.
No, you can't.
do
I mean, it just doesn't work.
Smart guy, wrong idea. Can't do it.
It unravels in all sorts of ways that nobody would really want to accept. So I mean, that can't work. Now the question about is Christianity over is a really big and interesting question, and I would say obviously by virtue of my faith and hope that I think that anything that continues to live is attached to the vine, grafted to the vine of Christ. But I do think it's worth recognizing that there are some really profoundly interesting. Saints are always fascinating people. They're not. It's not just sort of run of the mill. And there are always examples of the living examples of the Christian faith that are thrilling and life-giving and open and creative and original and so forth. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned John Vervaeke, and I don't want to. I'm not actually putting words in his mouth. This is something I heard him say, but I recall on one conversation that he had with Jonathan Pajot, who's also a friend of his. He had John Vervaeke had grown up, as I understand it, and I don't want to oversimplify his story, but I understand that he grew up in a kind of evangelical, very harsh sort of evangelical household, and I think that has left scars that he's talked about. It sounds like it. I don't know the details, but it sounds like it was created quite a bit of suffering, which you can appreciate with a mind and soul like that in such constraints.
Totally makes sense.
But he said at one point in a conversation with Jonathan Pageau, he said, if your Christianity was the one that I grew up with, I would still be Christian.
Wow.
And I thought, that's interesting. And I mean, because, Pageau is
Orthodox.
He's Orthodox, but he's right. And so it's not an evangelical.
Right. It's a very deep faith. It's a liturgical faith.
It's a liturgical faith, and it's a liturgical faith that opens up it ontologically. Right. It actually is a whole vision of reality. The symbolic world, right. And there's beautiful. So much of that Vervaeke himself, So I suspect this is going to be an ongoing conversation with him and Jonathan.
So you think it's a failed project ultimately? That there is going to be a dominant philosophy behind a society that underlies it, and
that's right.
The best case would be that it's the Catholic. And I had the conversation with Professor Napier, and he's playing with this idea that he's making the argument that it is rational, even if you're not a believer, to outsource your conscience to the Catholic Church's magisterium. And his argument is something, and forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, Professor Napier, but that it's been tried everywhere.
Yeah,
it's been tried for a really long time, and wherever it goes, if you follow the teaching correctly, it produces saints.
Yeah.
So it's if you're debating something, you should think about what does the Catholic Church say about this moral issue? Because
and we see that. I mean, I mentioned my wife earlier. I'll mention her again. She's pointed out that whenever you have religion depicted in the movies in Hollywood, it's always a Catholic priest. There's a certain sense in which the Catholic Church represents sort of serious religion.
Right.
And and I would include Orthodox here. The
old one,
that actually has the tradition, the whole tradition. Because I think that's crucial, and it helps us see. I had when I taught undergrad for many years, I had this experience of my best and brightest students tended to be fascinated by Buddhism. They all wanted to be Buddhists. I had a Chinese colleague. I was talking to her about this, and she said, "Why do they want to do that? Buddhism is so boring." And I thought, well, it's boring to you maybe, but it's exciting to them precisely because it's a break from what they see around. It seems to be something really. They want something radical.
Right.
And that's the tragedy. The problem is that when Americans decide to become Buddhists, I mean, we can't really. We can only do Buddhism light. We can only do these sort of.
There's sort of like our impressions of what it is. That's interesting. Yeah. There's a funny Catholic comedian, and she's talking about the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. She says, we're just a more serious faith, because it's like when you need an exorcism, you don't call Pastor Bill, the guy with the funny hair. Like you call the Padre, you call Father Luigi. You want him over there to throw the holy water. Right. You don't need the rock star. That's not who you're going for.
Yeah.
And there's this great reminds what you were just saying about Buddhism light. It reminds me of.
I mean, because the thing is, we're not just talking about a faith. We're talking about a whole culture and a whole vision of reality,
tradition, like you said earlier,
a tradition and a whole way of organizing human existence from start to finish. Yeah. We're talking about a cosmology,
right? And a philosophy like Justin Martyr,
and a philosophy,
right? A true philosophy.
Yeah.
The Justin Martyr. I'm a big fan of. That's exactly right. He was like a Platonic philosopher, and then he came to the Christian faith. Oh, this is the right philosophy.
The true philosophy. He said. Yeah.
Reminds me of that. There's this great New Yorker cartoon, and it's a guy with went the Hare Krishna robes, and his parents, and he's in his home bedroom, and his mother and father are standing at the doorway, and they say, your mother and I have discussed it, and we think it's okay if you become a heroin addict again. so we get these spiritual enthusiasms in the world, and they're to be encouraged, but hopefully moved towards a real religion. Towards a religion that's nutritious, not I struggled for 20 years out there in this kind of postmodern, little Buddhism here, a little Hinduism here, yoga, right? It's just, at the end, you're still God, and you have nothing. You're making You're making it up as it goes along. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
That's
it doesn't have integritas.
And it
certainly lacks.
And at the heart of so much of this is a desire to belong to something bigger than ourselves. And,
Amen.
And it can't, when you're picking 100%. And choosing bits.
When I went into the church, when I was doing RCIA, I was at the Archdiocese in Philadelphia, the Cathedral Basilica, and it was during COVID. So outside was total insanity. Like, people had just discovered that they were going to die. Yeah. Like, all of a sudden, they're like, oh my gosh, we might die. And then 5 masks and, the whole thing. And then I'd go into Mass, and it was like everything would slow down. Yeah. And the beautiful procession with the Gregorian chant and the incense. And here I am. We're talking, right? It's just, this is home. This is, these people get it. Yeah. What's going on outside, whatever we did right, we've done a lot wrong out there. That's right. I want to be in here. Yeah. This is sanity. Yeah. That's insanity. Yeah. It was just that clear. But Professor, it was really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. You've given me even more than I asked for, and I really appreciate it.
No, I enjoyed it very much. And I wish you luck.
Thank you very much.